Right, once again, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Czeslaw Siekierski, the European Parliament Deputy and the Vice Chairman of the Commission for Agriculture and Rural Development.
If you allow me, ladies and gentlemen, in order to be more specific, I will follow my notes, and so I do apologize for that. Well, first of all, ladies and gentlemen, when we look at the evolution of the Common Agricultural Policy, we recognize a clear set-out direction. CAP fulfilled various functions, and hence there were new expectations expressed, and it was necessary to provide convincing arguments for the European taxpayer to provide funding for the CAP. There were various problems that were presented by the chairperson, but these problems have been resolved, namely first shortage of food and then surplus of production. And I recall very well in 2007 when there was the problem of the global food crisis. This did not affect Europe, nor did it affect Poland. But at that time, I saw serious concern among politicians. What needs to be done in order to avoid food crisis in Europe? When the times are good, there will be plenty of complaints that the Common Agricultural Policy takes up too much of the funds, taking away the budget from other objectives and measures. This is one issue. And now the second. In the EU, particularly in the Parliament, there is a strong domination of organizations such as Greens, Socialists and Liberals, who have a very clear focus on greening environmental measures, and which is also visible in other areas, not only in agriculture, particularly with respect to counteracting climate change. And hence, the measures with a view to limitation of CO2 emissions and climate-related actions has become, if you will, a form of religion for some. I believe that sometimes this borders on the borders on the admissible part of activities. And I do believe that in a time of crisis, slowdown in the economy, imposing such additional cost on the economy in relation to climate protection is really open to discussion. And by that I don't mean that we should abandon environmental measures and climate protection. We all subscribe to that, but it's just to recognize the impact that Europe can have on global emissions, and where Europe is not the dominant polluter. So one has to remember that this also had an impact on the political measures taken with respect to CAP. And I must say the discussions are very challenging, particularly with our colleagues from the Greens, which have support from many of the socialist and liberal parties. This also impacts, as I said, the outcome of votes and the issue of CO2 and CO2 emissions and choice of electrical energy generation resources. Here in Poland we are dependent on the hard coal, And in the European Commission, there are many quite determined commissioners who have a strong impact, and also the strong impact of NGOs. And there are so many emails and forms of pressure that it is quite daunting, and one could call it a very fierce lobbying activity. So all of this creates a certain climate in terms of greening, and recently there has been quite a lot of discussion and that we need to preserve the common agricultural policy, but in order to do that we need to prove its justification through greening measures. And this is something that the citizens of Europe will recognize as the correct step. Now, I believe greening has really taken the foreground, even pushing away or pushing down in terms of importance food security. But I think we need to recognize this in the global context, in the measures at the WTO level, measures to ensure competitiveness, the forms of support and that is given to agriculture to preserve competitiveness. But at the same time, we have to recognize that agriculture in Europe is very diversified. Actually, there are big differences in agriculture even within my own country, within Poland. In the past, there was mentioned that we had problems with the state farms or land from the old state farms, but this problem has been dealt with. There are tenants, there are landowners, there's parties interested in buying land, so it's not a problem of the legacy of the old state farms. The problem is rather now with very fragmented farms. Extensive farming. And yesterday I was traveling to Poland and said that only every 10th piece of land is actually cultivated in the southeast of the Świętokrzyskie province. And of course, one could say that this serves the purpose of greening, but is that really what is at heart of the matter? Because what type of greening are we thinking about? We need to address issues in a global terms, recognizing what is happening also in other countries in terms of the greening efforts. And in general terms, in the Commission and in the European Parliament, there was the concept of greening. We feel that farmers are rational beings, and I could serve, of course, many other examples. There is the intensification of agricultural activity, which limits greening to a certain extent, but the question really is, do we sacrifice agricultural output for the sake of greening? And Professor Rutherford wrote a lot about organic farming. Organic farming was very much linked with nature and with the environment. I think that we will be able to arrive at a consensus. There is dialogue ongoing. There is an ongoing dialogue between the European Council, the Commission, and the Parliament, because it needs to result in an agreement. At the last summit, the Prime Minister of Ireland, Mr. Barroso, and the President of the Parliament, Mr. Schulz, had agreed on one of the conditions that the Parliament requested in terms of financing of the past due payments of 2012. In other words, to increase the budget of 2013 by nearly 11 billion euros in 2 phases in order to pay out those monies that are due to countries that should have received those payments. So the Parliament and the Agricultural Commission need to make certain concessions, because in Europe we really use 2 buzzwords, compromise and competitiveness. And of course we cannot have compromise only by increasing the budget, but also by ensuring that we do not engage in a deficit-making activity, which might be the undoing of weaker companies. And we need to also ensure that the budget is sufficiently flexible, so that funds that are not utilized can stay in the budget, and that all of this is more sensible. In the Agriculture Commission, where there is 80% of farmers sitting, so no matter what in the Parliament, no matter what political option they represent, members can see eye to eye. But then when the matter is taken to the plenary debates, well, sometimes things take a different turn. I don't want to speak about the multifunctional landscapes. I think other people can address this much more effectively than I. But I think what I'm simply underscoring is that we need to take into account the differences that exist in European farming. And of course, there is a certain mission of equalizing direct payments, but one has to make things comparable. We can compare, for example, to Germany in production of cereals, maybe in terms of pig husbandry, to Denmark, though I think they're still ahead of us in horticulture with the Netherlands, because it's not possible really to compare one, let's say, hectare of land under vineyards with 1 hectare of land of cereals. Sometimes, of course, we think that Europe is vineyards, olive orchards, milk and butter, but we need to remember that there are differences. We need to arrive at a consensus, but we have to also agree on certain criteria that ought to be used. But as I said, in spite of all the complaints that we hear, and of course nobody can be fully satisfied with the reform of the CAP, nobody can be fully satisfied with greening. Some say it's too much, others too little, but I think this bodes well for a consensus, which will be good for the common agriculture policy and the future of the European Union.